In some regions of the Arctic, sailors began reporting something strange. A ship would appear on the horizon, silent, with no crew. Sometimes it was seen trapped between blocks of ice. Other times it drifted slowly through the freezing northern waters. And on some occasions it would disappear again for months, or even years. But it always seemed to return. Fishermen spotted it. Hunters found it drifting. Explorers saw it through the fog. And every time someone approached it, they discovered the same thing. An abandoned ship. No one on board. Still floating. This vessel became known as one of the most famous ghost ships in history. Its name was SS Baychimo. For decades, it was reported wandering alone through the Arctic, as if it had refused to disappear into the ocean. And it all began with a voyage that was supposed to be just another routine commercial journey in the far north of the planet. To understand the story of the Baychimo, we need to go back to the early 20th century, when large trading companies operated extremely difficult maritime routes in the Arctic. One of those companies was the Hudson's Bay Company, one of the oldest companies in the world still in operation. For centuries, it had established trading posts scattered across remote regions of Canada and the Arctic. These outposts depended entirely on ships to receive supplies, tools, food, equipment, and also to transport valuable goods such as animal furs, which were traded with local communities and later shipped to international markets. The problem was that these sea routes passed through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. For much of the year, the Arctic Ocean is covered in ice. Ships operating there had to navigate with extreme caution to avoid becoming trapped between floating ice floes capable of crushing a steel hull. It was in this environment that the SS Baychimo began its career. The ship was built in 1914 in Sweden, originally under the name Angermanelfen. It was a relatively small cargo vessel, about 70 meters long, designed to operate in cold waters and transport goods over long distances. Later, it was acquired by the Hudson's Bay Company and given a new name, Baychimo. For years, the ship served as a crucial part of the supply network that kept trading posts operating in the most remote regions of the Canadian Arctic. Each shipping season followed roughly the same pattern. During the summer and early autumn, when the ice partially retreated, ships like the Baychimo departed loaded with supplies. They visited trading posts scattered across the north, delivered goods, and then returned carrying furs and other products. But in 1931, one of those voyages would end in a completely unexpected way. And it would begin one of the strangest stories in Arctic navigation. In the late summer of 1931, the Baychimo was carrying out another of its regular voyages through the Canadian Arctic. The ship had visited several Hudson's Bay Company trading posts along the coasts of Alaska and Canada, delivering supplies and collecting furs destined for international markets. But the Arctic shipping season was always short. As autumn progressed, the ice began to return quickly. Temperatures dropped, and large sheets of ice started forming again across the ocean. Ships that stayed in the region too long risked becoming trapped. That is exactly what happened. In October 1931, the Baychimo became surrounded by ice in the Chukchi Sea, near the coast of Alaska. The sudden advance of the ice completely blocked the ship's movement. The crew waited, hoping for a natural opening between the ice floes, something that occasionally happened when strong winds pushed the ice away. But days passed, and the ship remained trapped. Temperatures continued to fall, and it soon became clear that the Baychimo would not escape before the Arctic winter fully set in. The ship's captain, John Cornwell, realized the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. Being trapped in Arctic ice during the winter could mean months of isolation in extremely harsh conditions. Because of this, the Hudson's Bay Company decided to organize an evacuation. Most of the crew were removed from the ship by aircraft and transported to safety. But a small team remained on board. Their objective was simple. Wait for the ice to break at some point and attempt to recover the ship when it became possible. For weeks, those men continued living aboard the Baychimo, surrounded by a frozen ocean stretching as far as the eye could see. The ship was completely motionless, locked between massive blocks of ice. Then, on November 24, 1931, a violent storm struck the region. Strong winds swept across the frozen sea. Visibility dropped. And during the storm, something unexpected happened. When the team returned to the location where the Baychimo had been trapped, the ship was gone. For a moment, everyone believed it had been crushed by the ice and sunk. But a few days later, local hunters reported something surprising. They had seen the ship, floating in the ocean, alone. When the reports arrived, many people assumed there had been some kind of mistake. The Baychimo had disappeared during a violent storm in the middle of the Arctic ice. The most logical explanation was that the ship had been crushed by the ice floes or had simply sunk somewhere in the Chukchi Sea. But the hunters insisted. They had seen the ship. A few days later, members of the Hudson's Bay Company decided to verify the reports themselves. They traveled across the region using sleds and small boats, searching for any sign of the missing cargo ship. And then they found it. The Baychimo was there. Still floating. The ship had been freed from the ice during the storm and was now drifting slowly between the ice floes of the Arctic Ocean. The team managed to board the vessel again. Inside, everything was almost exactly as it had been left. Equipment, supplies, and part of the cargo were still intact. But there was a problem. The ship was still surrounded by large, constantly shifting blocks of ice. Towing the Baychimo into open water at that moment would have been extremely difficult and dangerous. Even so, the team decided to try to recover at least part of the cargo. For several days, men worked to remove goods from the ship and transport them across the ice using dog sleds. Crates of furs and other valuable products were taken from the vessel. While this work continued, the Baychimo drifted among the ice floes, slowly pushed by currents and wind. At some point, the situation became even more complicated. Ice conditions began changing rapidly. Massive blocks started pressing against the ship's hull. And the team realized that staying there much longer could become dangerous. That was when the final decision was made. The Baychimo would be abandoned. The Hudson's Bay Company concluded that trying to recover the ship was not worth the risk to the crews involved. The vessel had served its purpose for many years, and now it was trapped in an environment where nature had complete control. So, by the end of 1931, the Baychimo was officially considered lost. The ship was left drifting in the Arctic. No crew. No destination. The expectation was simple. Sooner or later the ice would crush the hull or the ship would eventually sink. But that is when the story of the Baychimo began to turn into something far stranger than anyone could have imagined. Months after the ship had been abandoned, some residents and hunters living along the coastal regions of Alaska began reporting something unusual. They were seeing the Baychimo again. The ship appeared in different locations along the Arctic coast, always floating alone among the ice floes. Sometimes it was partially trapped in the ice, while other times it was completely free, drifting slowly with the ocean currents. These reports began to appear throughout the following years. Inuit hunters reported seeing the ship wandering across the ice. Fishermen navigating the region claimed they had encountered the cargo vessel drifting at sea. Explorers also began recording sightings. On some occasions, people even managed to board the Baychimo again. Inside the ship, the situation felt almost surreal. The vessel was empty, silent, and covered with ice in many areas. The cabins had been abandoned, equipment still lay scattered around, and part of the cargo that had not been removed remained inside the ship. But the most remarkable thing was the ship's condition. Despite drifting in the Arctic for years, the Baychimo was still floating. Its hull had survived the ice, the storms, and the powerful currents. In 1933, a group of hunters managed to board the ship again. They spent some time exploring the interior, recovering a few useful items and observing how the cargo vessel remained structurally intact. But they did not attempt to tow it. The Baychimo was in an extremely difficult region to operate in, surrounded by unstable ice and far from any rescue infrastructure. So the ship continued its solitary journey. Throughout the 1930s, new reports continued to emerge. Some people claimed to see the Baychimo being slowly pushed between massive blocks of ice. Others said it would suddenly appear through the fog, like a ghost ship emerging from nowhere. Sometimes the cargo vessel remained in the same area for weeks. Then it would disappear again. And months, or even years later, it would be spotted somewhere else in the Arctic. The ship seemed to simply refuse to sink. Ocean currents and shifting ice continued pushing the Baychimo slowly across the Arctic Sea. Over time, it became something of a regional legend. Fishermen and explorers began calling it the ghost ship of the Arctic. But the most remarkable part is that the sightings continued for decades. Over the following years, the Baychimo continued appearing in different regions of the Arctic, as if it were following an invisible route determined only by the wind, ocean currents, and the constant movement of ice floes. Reports began to accumulate. In 1934, the ship was spotted again near the coast of Alaska. A group of explorers reported seeing the cargo vessel in the distance, trapped between large blocks of ice slowly drifting across the ocean. The following year, another group claimed to have seen the Baychimo wandering once again among the ice. The ship seemed to continue surviving conditions that would have destroyed many other vessels. During the Arctic winter, sea ice expands with enormous force. Large ice floes can press against and crush steel hulls as if they were fragile structures. Many ships that become trapped in these conditions are slowly destroyed. But the Baychimo seemed to escape that fate repeatedly. Its reinforced hull, designed for navigation in cold waters, helped it withstand the pressure of the ice. In addition, the fact that the ship was empty meant it could move more freely between ice floes when currents shifted. Instead of remaining completely trapped and crushed, the cargo ship was often simply pushed into different areas of the ocean. And so it continued drifting. In 1939, an Inuit family reported encountering the Baychimo again. They boarded the abandoned ship and spent some time exploring its interior. According to later reports, the inside of the vessel was deteriorated but still recognizable. Empty cabins. Equipment scattered around. Parts of the ship covered in ice. The vessel seemed frozen in time. After that encounter, the Baychimo disappeared once again into the fog and ice fields of the Arctic. But the story did not end there. In the years that followed, new reports continued to emerge. Explorers claimed to have seen the ship drifting. Fishermen reported spotting the dark silhouette of the cargo vessel appearing among the ice floes. Sometimes it seemed trapped. Other times it was free, slowly pushed by the ocean. One of the last widely documented sightings occurred in 1969. That year, a group of hunters in Alaska reported seeing the old cargo ship once again floating among the ice, almost 40 years after it had been abandoned. After that, the sightings began to disappear. The Baychimo was never officially seen again. But for nearly 4 decades, that abandoned ship continued appearing in the Arctic, defying the expectations of everyone who believed it should have sunk long before. What happened to it after 1969 remains unknown. It is possible that the hull was finally destroyed by the ice, or that the ship quietly sank somewhere in the remote waters of the Arctic Ocean. But to this day no one has ever found the wreck of the Baychimo. And because of that, the story of the ship that refused to sink remains one of the most fascinating in the history of polar navigation. An abandoned cargo vessel. No crew. Drifting alone through the Arctic ice for decades. After the last widely documented sighting in 1969, the Baychimo simply disappeared once again into the vast Arctic Ocean. No signal. No confirmed sinking. No wreckage ever found. And that raises a question that still intrigues maritime historians, Arctic explorers and researchers to this day. What really happened to the Baychimo? There are several possible explanations. The most straightforward one is this. At some point after 1969, the ship was finally crushed by ice or quietly sank somewhere in the remote waters of the Arctic Ocean. This is a very plausible scenario considering the extremely harsh conditions of the region. Arctic ice exerts enormous pressure on any vessel trapped between its moving plates. Even reinforced hulls can eventually fail after years of exposure to such a hostile environment. Another possibility is that the ship may have continued drifting for some time before finally disappearing. Arctic currents are complex and can carry objects across enormous distances over the course of decades. In some cases, ship debris has been found thousands of kilometers from the place where it was originally abandoned. In the case of the Baychimo, however, no definitive evidence has ever been discovered. Over the years, some expeditions have attempted to locate the ghost ship. Explorers and researchers analyzed old sighting reports and tried to estimate possible routes the cargo vessel might have followed based on ocean currents and the movement of Arctic ice. But finding a lost ship in the Arctic is not an easy task. The region is enormous. Much of the ocean remains covered in ice for a large part of the year. And many areas are still extremely difficult to explore. Even with modern technology, locating a ship that may have sunk anywhere across such a vast area is a massive challenge. Because of this, the final fate of the Baychimo remains a mystery. And perhaps that is exactly what makes its story so fascinating. For decades, the ship appeared repeatedly in different parts of the Arctic. It was seen by fishermen, explored by hunters, spotted by explorers, always abandoned, always silent, always floating alone among the ice. And each new sighting reinforced the reputation of the Baychimo as a true ghost ship. Today, more than 90 years after it was abandoned in the ice, the story of the Baychimo is still remembered as one of the most curious episodes in maritime history. A ship that should have disappeared quickly, but that kept returning, year after year, decade after decade, as if it simply refused to sink. Stories like this remind us of something fascinating about the ocean. Even in the modern era, mysteries still drift across the seas of our planet. Lost ships, strange sightings, and stories that continue to resist complete explanations. If you enjoy real stories like this, about ghost ships, ocean mysteries, and unusual events in maritime history, leave a like on this video. It really helps the channel continue producing long, detailed documentaries like this one. And if you want to follow more fascinating stories about the sea, famous shipwrecks, and mysteries that still intrigue explorers and historians, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the ocean still holds thousands of stories, and many of them are still waiting to be discovered. Over the decades, the story of the Baychimo began to take on an almost legendary status among sailors, explorers, and Arctic researchers. In regions where ice dominates the landscape for most of the year, stories about abandoned ships drifting through the ocean have always sparked curiosity. But the Baychimo was different. It wasn't seen just once or twice. It was seen repeatedly. Reports continued to appear for nearly 40 years after the ship was abandoned in 1931. That means different generations of people encountered the vessel. Some were local hunters. Others were explorers or crews of ships operating along northern routes. In many of these reports, the description was always similar. A solitary ship. No signs of a crew. Moving slowly among the ice floes. Sometimes tilted. Sometimes partially covered in ice. But still floating. Because of this, many began calling it the ship that refused to sink. For anyone familiar with the Arctic environment, this is even more remarkable. Sea ice exerts enormous pressure on structures trapped between its shifting plates. In some cases, ice blocks several meters thick can press against a hull with enough force to bend steel. This is exactly the kind of force that has destroyed numerous ships throughout the history of polar exploration. One of the most famous examples was the ship Endurance from Ernest Shackleton's expedition, which was crushed by Antarctic ice in 1915. But the Baychimo seemed to escape that fate again and again. One possible explanation is that the ship was not permanently trapped in the ice. In many cases, the cargo vessel was seen drifting slowly with the currents and wind, moving along with the ice fields rather than being compressed between them. This constant movement may have helped relieve some of the pressure on the hull. In addition, the ship was relatively small and had been designed to operate in cold regions, meaning its hull was more robust than many cargo ships of that era. Even so, surviving for decades in that environment remains extraordinary. Over time, the Baychimo stopped being just an abandoned ship. It became a kind of symbol of the mysterious stories that emerge from the most remote regions of the planet. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this story so fascinating even today. Because unlike many other ships lost at sea, the Baychimo did not disappear immediately. It remained present, appearing and disappearing on the frozen horizon of the Arctic, like a silent shadow drifting through the ice. Over time, the Baychimo stopped being just a cargo ship lost in the ice and began to occupy a very unusual place in maritime history. In a world where most shipwrecks end quickly, with vessels disappearing beneath the water in minutes or hours, the Baychimo followed a completely different path. It simply continued to exist. There was no crew, no maintenance, no one steering the helm. Yet the ship kept drifting, carried by the currents and winds of the Arctic, moving slowly through endless fields of ice. In many sighting reports, the Baychimo was described as suddenly appearing through the fog. In the Arctic, visibility can change quickly. One moment the horizon is completely empty. The next, a dark silhouette appears among the ice floes. And that is exactly how many people said they saw the ship. A shadow on the ice. A solitary hull floating in the absolute silence of the polar ocean. No movement. No life on board. For those navigating such remote regions, encountering an abandoned ship like that must have been unsettling. Imagine sailing for days or weeks through a landscape dominated only by ice and water, with no signs of human presence for hundreds of kilometers, and suddenly finding a full ship, seemingly intact, standing between the ice floes. It is easy to understand why the Baychimo gained a reputation as a ghost ship. But despite the mysterious aura surrounding the vessel, the story of the Baychimo also reveals something fascinating about the power of nature and how the ocean can preserve or destroy human structures. Abandoned ships usually do not survive very long. Storms, corrosion, ice pressure, and collisions with ice floes typically destroy them quickly. But in the case of the Baychimo, ocean currents, shifting ice, and the vessel's robust construction created a rare situation. Instead of being destroyed quickly, it was slowly carried by the ocean. Year after year. Decade after decade. At some point after 1969, the ship may finally have been crushed by ice or sunk somewhere in the remote Arctic. It is also possible that the remains of the vessel still lie on the seafloor, hidden beneath layers of ice and sediment. The fact is that no one has ever found the wreck. And because of that, the final fate of the Baychimo remains unknown. Perhaps somewhere in the Arctic there is a place where the rusting hull of that old cargo ship finally met its end. Or perhaps parts of it are still preserved beneath the cold northern waters. But regardless of where the ship ultimately ended up, its story remains one of the most unusual ever recorded in maritime history. An abandoned ship in the ice. No crew. No destination. And yet it continued to be seen for nearly 40 years. If you enjoyed learning about this real story of the Arctic ghost ship, leave a like on the video. It helps the channel continue bringing long, detailed documentaries based on real events in maritime history. And if you want to follow more incredible stories about lost ships, historic shipwrecks, ocean mysteries, and real events that shaped the history of navigation, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the ocean still holds many mysteries, and some of the most fascinating stories of the sea are still waiting to be told.